Alright, so we're gonna get started. Sorry about the spontaneity of the room change. It was hard to anticipate. But yeah, so I want to thank everybody for being here. Obviously, this is an extremely important cause for all of us, despite any kind of views we have. It's important that we're going to talk about the logic of it, and we're going to really try to work towards some kind of, not necessarily a solution, but some, talking about our views, talking about the way we feel about the situation in general. In addition to thanking you guys for being here, I just want to also thank the Society of, the Students for Justice in Palestine. It's awkward.
I was like, wow, you guys are.
Yeah, this week we've been super busy. We've been working really hard, and I know a lot of you guys saw us out by the free speech lawn today. That was fun. But yeah, if you guys want to just start introducing yourselves.
Hi everybody, I'm Lissa. I'm the president of SJP.
Hi, I'm Rosil. I'm the vice president, and I'm a sophomore.
Hello, I'm Jude, and I'm the treasurer.
I'm Dia, and I'm a biomedical sciences major, and I'm a junior. And I'm also director of education.
Hi everyone, my name is Tahura Atik, and I'm the public relations director for SJP.
Alright, cool. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce Adam Mono. He's our moderator today. So everybody give it up for Adam.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that I've known Joey for a while now through a number of campus events and Model UN conferences that last way too long. And when he first asked me to moderate this panel here, I was slightly hesitant. As a journalism major, they kind of tell us to write about the news and not make the news. But when I learned more about SJP and about the philosophy of what this panel would be, I couldn't resist but getting involved. It's going to be a night that fosters inclusivity and openness and open debate. So I hope that you will join us in that, and I hope that any questions that you may have had about the topic are answered before the night is over. Before we move into debate, I just want to get into a couple of housekeeping matters. This is not going to be any kind of an aggressive discussion. This is a very civil panel, so please refrain from any clapping or heckling or snapping or booing or cheering that you may or may not want to do. We're here solely to hear the ideas of the panelists. So that being said, please keep in mind that this is a civil event and that we're here to listen to them. Neither panelist has taken a side or a stance before debate has begun, so also please keep that in mind. We will also allow time for questions after the panelists have spoken. And once my list has been exhausted, we will move into a Q&A session with the audience. So if you have any questions about anything that's being said, make sure that you're writing them down or keeping them in mind before we move on to the Q&A session. A note to the moderators, to the panelists, for the sake of time, each of you will be allowed 2 minutes to answer each question. After 2 minutes, I will tap you just so that you know to kind of wrap up your statement. And you will also be given 2 minutes as a wrap-up of your entire idea for the 5 questions that I will propose, as well as for the Q&A that will happen after. So just know that you will have time to have a closing statement, and you will have time to answer each question that is presented to you. That being said, I would like to begin with a question that some may find a little bit controversial, but I think is important considering the nature of the event.
Should we begin with introductions really quickly?
Yes, thank you so much.
So
I'm sorry, it's been a very long day.
Right.
I would have gotten to your name at some point, but this is better. I want to start by introducing Rasha Mubarak, who is a Palestinian American and the Orlando Regional Coordinator for the Council on American Islamic Relations of Florida. You can stand up so everybody just kind of knows who. Yeah, thank you. Chandra Keethi Reddy is a student activist and a math, industrial engineering, and philosophy major at the university. Noah Tan is an Israeli-American student activist and an international and global studies major. Dr. Barry Maurer is a professor here at the university in the Department of English, Text, and Technology. And Layla Abdelaziz is a Legislative and Government Affairs Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations. And my right-hand woman, apparently, so thank you. We'll begin with question number 1, which, like I said before, is an important gateway into the discussion that will be taking place tonight. And that question is, amidst the controversy, the emotions, and even the violence going on in the region, why, if for any reason, do you believe Zionism is important today? And we'll begin at the right-hand side of the panel.
Is that me?
Yes.
Zionism is a political system that defines a state that receives the largest amount of funding from the United States of any other foreign country in the world. So as Americans, first and foremost, we have to understand and know what Zionism is, because we as Americans are very committed to the current status quo of the Israeli state and the Zionist political agenda. I don't know if we should, are you going to define Zionism?
You can define it.
So I would define, my apologies, I'm in the middle of a cold, so I haven't coughed out right now. Zionism is the political ideology that I think largely was defined not until the end of the 20th century by Herzl's book. And Zionism is this idea that the Jewish people deserve a Jewish state. And in the 21st century, today in 2016, what defines that state is the state of Israel. It is occupying the Palestinian people. The state of Israel is the only state in the entire world that does not have defined boundaries. And I would also say that it's the only state in the world that has 3 ongoing different regimes. So there are 3 different realities of people that are living under 3 different conditions under the state of Israel, within occupied Palestine and in Gaza. And yeah, I don't want to rant for too long, but I think it's very important for us as Americans to understand what Zionism means in 2016, and to even understand that within the Jewish American community and within the Jewish global community, this idea of what Zionism is no longer stable. It is beginning to be very critically it's being criticized within the Jewish American community, within the Jewish global community, and even within the state of Israel.
Thank you so much. Okay. Dr. Matt.
All right, thank you. Well, I agree with a lot of what you said, and what I would add is that Zionism is important historically. I am Jewish, and my family on both sides is Jewish, and my relatives came from Eastern Europe. So what's interesting is how politically they evolved, and that's how I came to understand this, is that Zionism was not a major force within Jewish political thought. It was a kind of minor force, and most Jewish politics were internationalist. Zionism is nationalist. Okay, so that's probably the major difference, I would say, between Zionism and other Jewish political thought. Not only that, but most Jewish politics, at least in Europe, were leftist internationalist. Zionism early on had some leftist tendencies, but became it sort of became more right-wing as time went on, and now essentially is represented by Likud and their coalition. But I would say Zionism is not monolithic. There are some egalitarian, secular Zionists. There are others who are far more, I guess they don't want a secular state, they want a religious state. And so there's quite a variety within it. But at base, what I would say is historically what makes Zionism part of our modern world is that it is a settler country. It's not a colonial country in the same way that some other colonial countries are. It similar to the United States, and there was a colonial power here, which was Britain, but also people came here for religious purposes. They wanted to establish an Eden on earth. And Zionism has some of the same impulses to it. It was under British rule, but then it was settled by people who had some profound religious vision attached to their idea of nation.
Chandra?
Well, if we're going to ask why is Zionism important, let's start with what is Zionism. The best way that I can characterize it, not to define it, but to characterize it, is I would say that Zionism is a nationalist ideology, which is not an insult. An ideology is not an illness that people have. It is a framework that people use to understand and interpret the political realities within which they are situated. When I say that Zionism is a nationalist ideology, it means that this is a group of people within a framework who are trying to gather together around the cause of providing a home base for their people. A home base after well, frankly, there just aren't any words for what happened at the beginning of the 20th century to many of the people, or to many of the ancestors of the people who are in Israel right now. And there are many people looking for that kind of home. And I think if we're going to ask the question, why is Zionism important, I think we should leave it open. And what I mean by that is not to say, let's not solve it, let's not try and figure it out. What I mean is we should come together, try and understand what are the needs of the Zionists, and at the same time, expect of the Zionists to be able and willing to address and speak with the needs of Palestinians.
According to UN Resolution 3397, Zionism is a form of racism and discrimination, and that's a quote from the United Nations, also the same entity that declared Israel a state in 1948. Zionism is important. It's important today because of the disposition of Palestinians that exist all across the world. It's the violence. It's the reason why that there's so much chaos in Israel and in Palestine. You know, before 1948, they shared Palestinians and Jews said Jude because my niece. Jews shared this vivacious lifestyle. I mean, before Sabbath, Palestinians let their Jewish neighbors pump water. I mean, they lived in harmony and peace. So to say that Palestinians and Jews cannot live in peace is untrue, because it existed, it was real. There was a serenity in Jews living in Palestine. Now these Jews, whether they migrated from Europe or they were Arab Jews, they were considered Arab Jews. And they lived amongst the Palestinians. They lived in harmony. So Zionism is a form of racism. It's a form of discrimination. Zionism is a question of entitled religiosity versus justice for all, justice for Jews, justice for Palestinians, and justice for Muslim, Jew, and Palestinian Christians. So it's important today because it is the reason why so many Palestinians and Israelis live in terror, live in fear. There's post-traumatic stress disorder. So Zionism, if you believe in Zionism, then essentially you believe in the displacement of Palestinians and marginalizing a group of people.
Yeah, basically I really like the different definitions that we've had so far. I agree with all of them to different extents. I think absolutely there have been racist acts and awful oppression committed in the name of Zionism. There have also been pretty decent things, people given homes who didn't have them, people given haven who didn't have it in the name of Zionism. I think, as was said before, there's a multiplicity within it, and while various groups have tried to give it definitions, if you ask someone who defined themselves as a Zionist, you might find someone who has very, very different political ideologies and religious ideologies. So I think Zionism is important today because anti-Zionism and pro-Zionism are sort of the sides. I hate to say sides, but a lot of the big part of the differing viewpoints in the discussion about Palestine, about Israel, and the value that people hold in Zionism, either as a racist ideology, a political ideology, or a framework, as was said, kind of defines people's opinions on the issue, and their experience in those places, experience in Israel, experience in Palestine, very much plays a big role in, I think, how people define themselves or others as Zionists.
Thank you. Just an update, I guess, on the status of this panel and of this week on campus. A fellow student organization here at UCF has started a protest week to our week, which many of you may know is being labeled Israeli Apartheid Week. It has sparked a counter week known as Israeli Peace Week. And because of that, I would like to pay extra attention to this question, and I would like to allow any panelists who may have something else to say about Zionism and its importance the floor for another 2 minutes, if anybody is interested.
I just want to touch base on the giving a home. Actually, that's before Zionism, because when the Holocaust did happen, Palestinians actually housed Jews that migrated from Europe. So that, housing Jews and welcoming them, migrating to Palestine was before Zionism. So I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with the point that it helped house. It actually helped put people out of houses, in my opinion.
May I reply?
I believe that you wanted to reply.
Just do a rebuttal.
Yeah.
Oh, no, just because it was directed at
Yeah.
me. I would love to give my time to you after.
Yeah, no, go
I
ahead.
talk. I absolutely see where you're coming from, as in the different historical context of when things happen different times. But I was just saying that just to define Zionism in that way is not the way that I've heard it defined in different communities. And in your definition of Zionism, the previous statement about housing Jews and separation and living together is absolutely correct. In other people's, it might not be seen that way, but I completely see where you're coming from.
Ultimately, Zionism is important because it is the political ideology that has defined the most contentious conflict of the 20th century that has now been passed over to the 21st century. We cannot deny that the establishment of the State of Israel has created a global refugee population of 8 million Palestinian people. The Palestinian diaspora now numbers 8 million people. These are people that, some of which have been waiting resettlement and the return to home since the 1940s. So right now, as millennials, we're also dealing with the largest humanitarian crisis of modern history, which is the Syrian refugee crisis. But keep in mind that within the Syrian refugee population, there are Palestinian refugee communities that have been refugeed since the 1940s. This is a reality, and from a Palestinian perspective, the reality of the prolonging of the status quo and of the State of Israel doing as it pleases without any accountability is that Palestinians are being ethnically cleansed from their homeland. They are the indigenous population that is being thrown into a global community without any hope for a return home. So I think that's why ultimately Zionism is important, because it defines this very long conflict that we have to solve, that it's really incumbent on our generation to have people talk to each other instead of talk at each other and find a solution for this problem.
Thank you. Moving on to question number 2, you'll have time to respond to the next question. Nurit Peled Elhanan, who is a scholar of language and education at the Hebrew University of Israel, published a book in 2012 titled Palestine and Israeli School Books, Ideology, Propaganda, and Education. In it, she argues that the state-sponsored textbooks in Israel propagate a national narrative that encourage boys and girls to want to join the compulsory military system in Israel and directly engage the children in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict long before they should be exposed to such matters. According to you, what should the role of education be in the conflict? And we'll start at this side with Melanie.
All right, so as a person who, I am from Israel, I immigrated to the US when I was pretty young. All my family, besides my close family, still lives there. And every single member of my family, including my parents, my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents, is currently serving or has served in the IDF. So I'm very intimately acquainted with the kind of propaganda, with the kind of attitude that the Israeli government tries to propagate among Israelis. It's very much a one-sided picture. It's very much not even mentioning the state of Palestine, or mentioning it in a way that is sort of to the side, or we just try to protect ourselves from them. And I think this narrative is incredibly harmful to people both in Israel and in Palestine and in the US, because this narrative is propagated to everyone really through the media, through the Israeli government. And I think that it is inherently flawed. That it is a narrative that happens in Israeli schools, that you were saying, as well as in American Israeli communities, American Jewish communities that I've been in. And I think the role of education can be really great right now, because now we are seeing papers published examining this propaganda. We are seeing research, we are seeing numbers and statistics that show the kind of effect this propaganda is having. And given those things, we can then educate ourselves, as Layla said right before, that it is incumbent on us to educate ourselves to try to see past any sort of propaganda, any sort of narrative that is clearly untrue. A narrative like that, given the numbers of suffering and dead people, cannot be the case. And it's incumbent upon us to use the information that is out there now that wasn't not that long ago to educate ourselves.
Do you mind repeating that question?
Yeah, sure. What do you believe the role of education should be in the conflict, considering the, I guess, many instances of propaganda being found in schools or being claimed to have been found in school textbooks?
I mean, the reality is that it does exist in the Israeli schools. It does exist. The way that they actually present the history of the Palestinians, and they even push Palestinian Christian Zionism. I met with a Palestinian priest last week who was talking how he created the College of the Bible College of Jerusalem, and he was saying how a lot of the propaganda that's used in the Israeli schools is talking about not just pulling in the Jewish narrative, but really the Christian narrative, right? Because that's what ultimately the United States of America, a lot of the Christians believe that they're doing the right religious approach, but in reality, understanding Christian Zionism is important in education because that's used in the Israeli textbooks as well. Not that only does it, obviously emphasize the point that this is the Jewish state, the Zionism is part of being Jewish, and Jewish is being Israeli, Israeli equals being Jewish, which is not the reality. And so with the Christian Zionism, it teaches like Old Testament versus New Testament, where the Old Testament, obviously I only have 2 minutes, but the Old Testament, the way it's received is that basically saying that there's a land for the Jewish people, but in the New Testament, the way it's interpreted, it's actually talking about your homeland can be your heart, your homeland can be your mind, body, and spirit. So there is a propaganda there when they do use religious views, not just in Judaism, but in Christianity, obviously with Islam. They use buzzwords in not only their textbooks, but in the media, right? The way the way they present a Palestinian, 300 Palestinians being killed, it's 300 Palestinians died or passed away. When an Israeli is killed, it's Israelis murdered, slandered, killed, blood. You see those. So it's important the way that the buzzwords and the education system, the way that they present the Christian Zionism, Jewish entitlement, and Muslims being radicals. So all these roles play an impact, and there is a large propaganda in the Israeli school system with that.
What I'm about to suggest is not just something for education in Israel and Palestine, but something that I think is important for education in the world. When it comes to dealing with national conflicts, we have to realize that national conflicts are composed of conflicts between individuals. And if individuals are not educated on how to transform conflicts and on how to deal with conflicts effectively, they will not be in a position to transform the conditions that millions of people are subjected to. What I'm saying is that in K-12 education, everywhere in the world, it's important for us to stop treating education as encouraging the mere consumption of knowledge. We have to start looking at education as training individuals to not only produce knowledge, but also to produce, but also to have mechanisms, to have skills to actually deal with relationships, to actually deal with interpersonal conflict and strife. And by teaching individuals how to actually deal with interpersonal conflict and strife in an educational system, I think that will create a generation that will be able to resolve this conflict more effectively than any other generation that has ever lived.
Dr. Matt?
Well, I haven't seen any Israeli textbooks lately, so I'm not going to speak to those. But I will say that when I was growing up, my parents sent me to a Jewish camp, which was interesting. And what I found out about that was that it taught very little about Judaism, it taught very much about Zionism, and in fact it equated the two. The argument was that Theodor Herzl and the whole progression towards a Jewish state and its achievement and these various wars and so on constituted a new Jewish identity, and that they, of course, I think there was a millenarian and apocalyptic tone to it as well. That absolutely, this is about the absolute destruction of the Jewish people or their absolute salvation. There's nothing in between. And you see the same kind of language, I think, in terms of Christian Zionism, what you're talking about here, is we're talking about, although they're strangely reversed, they want the apocalypse to happen. But all this, keep in mind, so two things I want to say. One is that education does not just simply mean being in school and reading textbooks. We're educated from our parents, from popular media, and so on. Education constructs what we call human subjectivity within a variety of apparatuses or institutions. So there's a lot of redundancy, and the redundancy focuses on a couple things. One is entitlement and divine right, and that's the belief of the settler. Whether we're talking about the Israeli Jew or the South African or even the American Puritan, what we're talking about is a divine right of entitlement. Beyond that, the other thing I wanted to say is that Israel really exists as a client state primarily. And we were talking about this. U.S. aid to Israel is not benevolent aid. Israel exists as a political force because it is a U.S. client state that does the dirty work of the United States for it throughout the world. And for a long time, it was what propped up the South African apartheid state until that collapsed. But it still does the dirty work for the U.S. throughout the world.
A couple months ago, a textbook was banned from Israeli schools. And it was banned because, not a textbook, but a novel. The novel was banned because it was about a Jewish-Arab romance. And that was viewed as unacceptable and something that should not be allowed in Israeli school systems. Education is really important, and to go beyond what you were saying, I don't think it's just education. I think it's about the capacity to think critically, right? Like, the solutions are there. It's not that we don't know what the solution is to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Diplomats, academics, intellectuals, faith leaders, civil rights leaders, Palestinians, Jews, everyone knows what the answer to the solution, what the solution to the problem is. But ultimately what the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is power, right? Like, where is power? And for all struggles, for all movements of the oppressed, whenever there is such a large disbalance of power, it comes down to education. Education is the one thing that
Anybody who wants to start, we'll just wrap around.
Okay. Well, when we look at the question, what do we think the U.S.'s role is? You can read that two ways. What do you think the United States government's role is? Or what do you think the United States people's role is? No one here, as far as I know, except maybe Layla, is like deeply involved in the government. But in terms of what we actually can do as individuals, I think there is a strategy that we can use here and now. It's based on everyday diplomacy. The idea of everyday diplomacy is that we are the arbiters of peace in the relationships that we have. We are the arbiters of peace in the conversations that we have. If we don't have peaceful conversations, if we don't have conversations that are directed towards peace fair, it's not possible. And so in terms of what we can do, I think that we can go out using social media to impact the mood of this conflict, to make peace look possible. And the way we can do that is by having higher standards for ourselves in terms of how we hold these conversations, higher standards to ourselves in terms of our ethical and emotional approaches to these, higher standards for ourselves in terms of our intellectual attention to the matters, or to the issues that matter. We have to do this. We have to go out there and show as examples that it is possible to have serious but also compassionate discussions on issues that are this polarizing and, frankly, murderous.
So it's interesting, a couple of months ago I went to this event called Orlando Speaks, and it was law enforcement, professors. It was really crazy because the professors are all like, you know, high spirits, and law enforcement is serious, and then local leaders. And one take-home message I remember was that sometimes it's hard for us to relate to a suffering people if we don't look like them. Even though we all kind of look alike, and you know, we always make a joke that, you know, Jews and Palestinians are like cousins or olad am, but in reality, it's important to remember. So looking at that, you know, everyone puts their kid to bed the same way. Everyone is brought to their knees when, you know, they're praying to God and they need something. And it's important to remember that a Jewish person's life is not more valuable than a Palestinian's life, and a Palestinian's life is not more valuable than a Jewish person's life. And I think, actually refreshing this idea that this is about humans, it's not about religiosity or entitlement, or I think remembering that's first and foremost, taking it back to the drawing boards and remembering that these are people's lives. When I go back to Palestine, my cousins think it's so cute that I'm trying to save Palestine. My cousins are like, Russia, we just want to go to the university and have a crush on a girl, but we can't even get to do that. And this guilt trip that I feel when I get to go to Haifa and Jaffa, and because I have American citizen, and my cousins have never set foot in any of those places. Their parents have, but they haven't. I mean, it's just remembering these basic, what's going on. So I think that's education. I encourage people, take it to social media and to get in mainstream media. It's so important because, like I said, it's all about buzzwords. You'll see repetition, right? And it's just, there will be a question and it'll just say, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, even though we're discussing the brutality of Palestinian boys in jails, and why are there 4,000 boys on age 12 in Israeli jails for throwing a rock. So I think it's important to get people into the mainstream media and to fix those buzzwords. Arabs will sometimes use the word Arab. Did you tap? I'm sorry. Okay, Arabs versus Palestinians, or even those are something to think about.
Great. So we did China did talk about different communities within the U.S., the government versus the people. And I want to talk about a specific community that I'm a big part of right now. Dr. Maurer also mentioned camping, specifically Jewish camping. And if y'all guys don't know, there's several Jewish organizations within the U.S. that run a lot of summer camps for children. I attended one for 11 years, and I'm going to be a counselor there for the second year this year. So this is a community I'm very, very closely affiliated with. Specifically within this Jewish camping community, within Jewish American youth groups and programming for children, there's a lot of uncritical, unconditional love for Israel. And as an Israeli person, I would like to be proud of my heritage. I would like to have that as an American immigrant, to have that great tradition of being proud of both being an American and also an Israeli. However, a lot of the people who are most involved, a lot of the Americans most involved in the discussion are Jewish Americans, who are coming from this background of being, I don't want to say indoctrinated, but having run an Israel Day at my camp and come against the administration for some of the things that we wanted to do. It's honestly pretty much indoctrination. It's pretty much indoctrination of a love for Israel, of a identity, of a Zionism that includes, as Dr. Maurer was saying before, Zionism as part of Judaism. And that's something that needs to change. It's something that, yes, love for Israel is important, yes, identity is important, however, you can't completely ignore reality that way and teach children a reality that is not true and expect them to grow up into Jewish Americans who can adequately understand and adequately give their perspective and ultimately elect representatives that will become a neutral party that will lead to peace and stability in Palestine, to something that, as Josh said, we have a lot of commonalities, and the desire for peace above everything is something that's expressed a lot. Thank you.
A conflict at this scale at the international level could not have lasted this long and could not be sustained if first and foremost Palestinians were not dehumanized. There's a very deep and very intentional dehumanization of the Palestinian people within Israel, Palestine, and within the global community that sustains this conflict. The United States has to move towards a direction of being a neutral party, and I think that there's you guys hear this all the time. You probably hear about the system is wrong, systematic problems, but the easiest way to tell you in 5 seconds is it's a systematic problem from the most local level to the international level of a very disbalanced power play that's sustaining this problem. And until we start, applying our own laws to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We have Senator Leahy's Leahy Law, which means that a military unit or a government cannot get military aid and cannot get weapons from the United States if it's committed human rights violations. Well, several units of the Israeli IDF have committed human rights violations. We have the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission within our Congress. It is the one commission that is vetted with and responsible for finding human rights violations in the global community. It's investigated human rights concerns everywhere in the world. It's never investigated human rights concerns in Palestine, Israel. When we meet with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, they're terrified. They're terrified. I mean, every member of Congress is very intimately comfortable with where they are at because they have a lot of Zionist support. And there are a handful that are brave enough to step away from that, but then they're threatened immediately. So we have to move towards being a neutral party at the national level, but at the individual level, you know, Palestinian civil society has asked for the international community to join their boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. And you as an individual have consumer power. That is something that you have time and time again, whether it was Cesar Chavez and the grape boycotts in the United States, or whether it was the international BDS campaign that ultimately found justice for South African apartheid victims. I think at the individual level, you should educate yourself and join the BDS campaign in solidarity with the Palestinian people.
Thank you. Dr. Mao?
2 points I want to make. One is, if we want to understand this problem, we need to look in the mirror if we're Americans, or, you know, because the United States and our predecessors, the colonialists and settlers who landed here, invented apartheid. Right. I mean, the South African apartheid regime looked to us because of how perfectly we decimated the local population, turned them out into you know, homelands that were, we call them reservations. And so, you know, the history of racial and religious persecution and domination in this country became the model for regimes around the world that wanted to do the same thing. So we really have to look in the mirror before we preach to other people. That being said, I am in favor of divestment. I think divestment is more powerful than boycott. The way to do divestment is not necessarily personally, like I've got Israel bonds, you know, and I'm going to sell it. First of all, you'll lose money and Israel will take it. But it's to pressure institutions that are invested in Israel to divest from those things. Now, part of the pressure is economic, but the much greater pressure is moral. Okay, so that is what actually caused the downfall of apartheid. It was the global divestment movement which caused universities, and I was there, I was at the University of Minnesota when I was a student. The Board of Trustees decided not to divest after a lot of pressure. We kicked them out of their room. I sat at the head of the table with my feet up on the desk, and all the students voted to divest. Well, within a couple of weeks, they changed their mind, and then within another few weeks, the regime was gone. So I do understand the power of divestment. It's not a perfect analogy between South Africa and Israel by any means, but it is a powerful tool.
Thank you, Dr. Maurer. I believe now with that, we'll be moving into our last question of the night, which is what can students, activists, and scholars in America and abroad do to uphold Palestinian rights and to accurately depict this conflict? We say that because we are in a university with a lot of students who voice their opinions on the matter very heavily, both from either sides and also from a neutral standpoint, considering our media and journalism students. So how can they best portray the issue here in America, and what can they do to uphold the rights of people who might not be considered? And I believe we'll start on this side with you.
Okay, so, you know, I've been active since I was a kid, and one of the first things I did was I joined Seeds of Peace, and I was super excited. It's this group that Jews and Palestinians work together, and I remember telling like the older generation, you guys, I'm working with Jews, I'm so excited. And I was like 15 at the time, and I was like the Palestinian chairwoman for the state, and everyone's like, okay, you know, good luck with that. And I'm like, why are not my Palestinian people supporting me? And I remember like we had to learn how to do the hora, which is the folklore, and then the debka. And every week we would meet, you know, and there would be 15 Palestinians and 2 Jewish people. By the 5th, you know, rehearsal, and we were working with JCC, I mean, and so they're a much larger community than the Palestinians. I remember my eyes lit up. There was like 15 Jewish kids that came, and Orlando, and then all of a sudden the media came. I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. The next day, the Orlando Sentinel was like, Jews in Orlando work for peace. And it was like a big shot of and for me, I think that was my first oh my God, how did that happen? And I remember crying at the next year, or the next week's rehearsal, and I remember the 2 Jewish girls that did keep coming were like, that was messed up, that was wrong. Like, they felt it. So I mean, you're gonna fail, but you're gonna learn from it, and you're gonna gain the other person's perspective. Even though there was a large amount of Palestinians and that, the narrative was flawed, completely flawed in the media, I still gained those 2 relationships, and I understood where they were coming from, and they can literally see the reality. I'm just like a 15-year-old's, fantasy world of trying to bring peace into the world. So I think, having this is powerful. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you guys are not happy with what I'm saying, and but this conversation is healthy, this dialogue is important, because this is, we are the new generation. We can't be like the Amos, or how do you say an uncle in Hebrew? We can't be those people. We don't. We have to be stronger than that, and we have to remember that we're going to be bringing our kids into the future. Our kids are going to be racially marrying each other, and there has to be accountability, though. We have to hold our uncles accountable. If I feel like a Palestinian is being, you see when Gaza is invaded, it's a bunch of F Israel, and I'm like, no, don't try to join the bandwagon, have a conversation, but at the same time, as Israelis or Jewish, do your research. I know that it's so powerful because I'm working with St. Luke's Church right now, and they've created a Holy Land partnership, and I get to sit back and watch Caucasian women in Dr. Phillips, this prestige area, talk about how they went to go to, see where Jesus was born, and they came back, and they're like, I can't believe for so long that my money has been going to occupy this people, Russia. I'm talking about
black. We'll see the oppressed through the struggle, and I think that we're going to see. I'm hopeful. I have no choice but to be hopeful that we'll find a solution during our lifetime. But the arms and the extent to which Israeli propaganda and Israeli power that sustains the status quo, and this is very real in our political system as well, from municipal to from student government politics all the way to presidential politics. There is an overwhelming amount of Zionist political influence. And right now, as Americans, again, as important as it is to educate ourselves, we also have to critically think about, is our relationship with the state of Israel interest-based or value-based? It goes back to what you were saying again. Is this really, are we supporting the state of Israel because it's the only democracy in the Middle East, which it's not, by the way, it's not the only democracy in the Middle East, and I would argue that Israel is not a democracy. But is Israel one of our largest allies because it is this democracy, this beacon of hope in this uncivilized Arab world, or is it because we have an interest there to global hegemony, to our military power influence across the world, to the intelligence base that we have with the Israeli government? So we really have to think critically about these relationships, why they exist, and how we can overcome them.
Thank you. I actually believe that you've led us into our third question, which is, now that many proposed solutions for the conflict have either failed or have been rejected by representatives from one party or the other party or the international community in general, what do you believe is the most viable solution in your opinion? And I guess we'll start stage right over here.
We can start with you. We can go down.
Well, I would say it's the one thing that the American government officials will never utter. It's the one-state solution, and the one-state solution means not dividing up the territory, but truly making the area a democracy, and giving the Palestinians within that larger area equal rights and so on. The problem with that is, of course, that it would dissolve Israel as a Jewish state, just in terms of the demographics of it. And so I'm not saying it's an easy or obvious, it's not an easy solution. But it also poses several problems. I mean, one, Israel right now is a Jewish state, but it's also a secular state. And it tries to walk that line or keep that balance or whatever. it's very problematic. It's a contradiction that really can't hold, especially given, again, the demographic problem. So if you bring in Palestinians into that democracy, it's probably not going to be a majority Jewish state anymore. There are even divisions, quite a number of divisions within Judaism, within the Arab. I mean, there are Jewish Arabs, there are Sephardic and African Jews, and there are, I mean, there's quite a number of divisions already. This would complicate the picture a great deal, but it would force them to reckon finally with what does it mean to be a democratic state with a very diverse population. Anyway, that's the solution. I would recommend one state.
I think right now, instead of us focusing on the end game, let's focus on what we can do here and now. We have to do our best to curb the violence. We have to do our best to ensure that diplomatic relations do not stagnate. We have to do our best to make sure that people are showing up to negotiations and are actually communicating with each other. If we're going to really talk about a solution, we have to talk about the things that have to happen in order for that solution, any kind of solution, to occur.
Yeah, so I definitely won't go into whether I believe I'm a one-stater or a two-stater. For me, looking at it as what it is, a humanitarian stress factor in the Middle East. I mean, this is something that 3,000 to 4,000 Palestinian boys of the age 12 are jailed. They're pulled out 3 o'clock in the morning. I mean, when I think about it, how many of us have ever enrolled in leadership programs before college? By a show of hands. Leadership programs, youth programs, okay. So imagine that kind of system is to what? Build confidence, it's to build, you know, the skills and talents, to have the confidence to expand your dreams, to go for your dreams, to reach high. So imagine a system that's in place indirectly to do the complete opposite. And that's what the IDF does. It's not maybe a written system, but if you look at what an IDF soldier said, he said, by definition, our purpose is to spoil the party. It's not because they really believe that a 9-year-old Palestinian boy threw a rock at a huge military tank. That's not why the boy is being pulled out 3 o'clock in the morning. It's to shatter his dreams. It's to humiliate him, to brutalize him, and to bring his confidence level down. Because what does that do? He's less likely to go to college. He's less likely to want to achieve. And to diminish that kind of thing, it's the exact opposite of empowering. It's disenchanting. So first of all, stop, with the brutality of the young Palestinian children of the future. Education has been so imperative with Palestinians. In fact, Arab Americans are the #1 educated minorities in the United States. And I believe it's because of the oppression and the occupation that we've seen in that region, because education is all we have. So let us educate our Palestinian children, let them, no more humiliation, no more intimidation. These Israeli soldiers, a lot of them are exhausted. Also, $10 million of our US dollars go to Israel military a day. We can use that money. How many homeless people do you see that you give your slice of pizza to downtown? Use our money here. Use our money that we can utilize it in so many different aspects. I think that's one solution. Remembering that we are Americans first, before and then calling Israel a democracy. It's not democratic. Let's make it democratic. African Jews are discriminated against every day. So this is something that I think is that education, like we were talking about previously, being able to have rights, your basic rights, and to just the whole idea of looking outside the box. It's not, this whole Israel has a right to defend itself. It's getting exhausting, because when they look at when sources are researched and they look at the studies of post-traumatic stress disorders, Palestinian respondents are highly more suffering from PTSD. That means they've seen more blood, they've seen more dead bodies. So this is something that post-traumatic stress disorder, that I worked with the Palestinian Medical Relief Society when I was in Palestine, and a lot of them are going through PTSD where they're peeing in their beds and everything like that. So it's real.
Noah?
Sorry, just to restate, the question was specifically about the solutions that we see in the future?
Yeah, what do you propose is the most viable solution to the future?
Great, yeah. I just want to speak to the single-state solution. I've heard a lot about single-state solution, about the democracy, as you said. I've also heard about the two-state solution. that is something that a lot of Israelis, a lot of Israeli Zionists, anti-Zionists, Jews, secular Israelis would also put forth. And I think there's merit to both of the ideas, but I do agree that diplomacy and on the personal level, education and stopping the interpersonal conflicts are very, very important. However, another aspect I think we need to talk about on the way to peace, on the way to any kind of stability, is the economics, is the resources in the region, is the blockading of Gaza, is the lack of water in the West Bank. There is, besides the physical violence, there is also economic warfare, basically being waged on the Palestinian people, which is not something that I think gets talked about in this discussion enough. And it's something that's very, very easy to ignore. It's very easy to ignore where the wells are. It's easy to ignore people who you don't see on your news. You don't see their faces. You don't hear their names, who are really struggling in these areas, who were separated by the separation wall and by Israeli occupation from resources, from land that they used to farm, from things that they need to survive. And I think that's something that, first of all, we need to acknowledge, because the US does not like to talk about it. And that's, I think, one of the problems. That's one of the reasons I think Students for Justice in Palestine is such a big movement right now. Why this week is so important is because we actually talk about these things that are happening, these facts, these realities that people are living. Yeah, and I think, as we said, like on different political levels in the United States, I think it's really important that the United States, on every level of government, recognize that that is happening. And the specific aid that is going to Israel, that is going basically only so that Israel does what the US wants, and so that Israel buys the maximum possible amount of US-made weapons, made by the local company, Lockheed Martin, but everyone else too. No, and I think that any solution requires stability in diplomatic relations, in interpersonal relations, in education, as we said, in the stopping of physical acts of violence by IDF soldiers, by everyone in the region, but also the ending of the economic warfare and the cutting off the Palestinian people from really necessary resources. Thank you.
So I definitely support the one-state solution. It is the solution that Palestinian civil society, it doesn't matter what I want, right? Like what matters is what do victims of oppression want. And Palestinian civil society, Palestinian academia, Palestinian intellectuals, Jewish Israelis have all said that a two-state solution is impossible. And I think it's difficult to understand why and what people mean when they say the two-state solution is impossible. But you know, imagine a strip of land and there's a nation that separates two strips from each other, right? So how do you have one state that is two territorial boundaries? That's one thing, first and foremost. Second is you have to recognize the reality that there are 600,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank, at least. I don't like the word settlers because I think that it implies that it's a temporary presence, but the settlements are not temporary huts. They are expansive cities. They are huge. I've seen these myself. I'm from Palestine. I was born in Palestine. I travel back to Palestine, Israel. And growing up, I used to believe in the two-state solution. I used to think that Palestinians deserve a state and Israelis deserve a state. But I think and I also studied peace and conflict resolution, but when you travel in the region and when you understand the intricacies of the occupation, when you understand the realities on the ground in Israel, Palestine, the two-state solution died 10 years ago. And people at the international level that are still advocating for the two-state solution, I think this is a political maneuver to prevent them from having to have an honest conversation of what is a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I can keep advocating for why I believe in the one-state solution for a long time, but the next thing I want to say is many of you evoke diplomacy. I believe that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict will not be solved within the chambers of the Israeli government. I think that the United States as the last remaining superpower, as the superpower that sustains the status quo as it stands in Israel-Palestine today, is the only place in the world where we can start having a constructive conversation towards a solution. And I think what that means is we have to become a neutral party. Before we can talk about diplomacy, we have to talk about being a neutral party that is fair to both the occupied Palestinian people and to the Israeli government. And what that means is, yes, we cannot be giving the state of Israel within the current status quo $3 billion of foreign aid a year. Another very interesting thing about that aid is Israel is the only country in the world that receives aid from the United States and can spend it as cash wherever and whenever it wants. So usually when you hear foreign aid or military aid, what that really means is that's a contract for a certain state to buy things that are American, right? So if we give foreign aid to Egypt, they have to buy military weapons from an American company. Israel is the only, I'm wrapping up, sorry. Israel is the only country in the world that can use some of that cash, some of that money as cash. Right now, the current negotiations that are happening between the US government and the Israeli government is to extend the current $3 billion a year for the next 10 years, and we will probably be increasing that to $4 to $5 billion a year. We're not talking about becoming a neutral party. We are talking about signing another 10-year contract that will maintain the status quo and keep Americans complicit in the current human rights violations that the Palestinian people are suffering under the Israeli regime.
Thank you. I'd just like to take the moment to cordially remind the panel that I know you're all very, very intelligent, but we only have so much time in the room, so if you could just please respect the thoughts and just wrap up within 10 seconds of them. That being said, I believe you have led us into what, yet again, another question. Noting our host nation for this panel and the host of many refugees from either side, as well as the host of many talks about this one issue, what do you believe is the role of the United States, if any, in inciting a solution or inciting peace among both states?
Your turns.
Oh.
Yep.
I
think we like rotate.
Blonde hair, blue eyes, big rings, like they're, it's definitely something to have a conversation about, and go to Israel and Palestine, go to the territory, the occupied territories and see.
Thank you. No?
Yeah, I think the social justice movement right now in the United States among the youth is really growing in power, really growing in popularity. There's a lot of strength behind Black Lives Matter, a lot of strength behind organizing for women's rights, organizing for the rights of different people in the US. And there's been a lot of discussion in those movements right now about allyship and what that should look like and what that feels like and what that can do. And I think even though many people here are Palestinian or have Palestinian heritage or have personal ties to it, most people in the US, most students do not. And I think it's really important to stress what allyship looks like, what kind of leadership positions people who are of Palestinian heritage should take, and what kind of supporting positions and what kind of interesting perspectives non-Palestinians can take. I think it's very important for us all to listen to people of Palestinian heritage. I think it's very important for us to stand in solidarity and stand in acceptance and stand in peace. I think that if Jews and Palestinians here in Orlando and Jews and Palestinians other places in the United States work together, then we can see on the national scale more of the sort of neutral party that we were saying is necessary for a successful solution to the conflict. We can see more of that sort of cooperation and that spirit of discussion. Let's sit down, let's discuss, let's work together to try to do something real. And that's what we did right now. We are sitting here, we are working together, and I know I've already learned things from the amazing panelists we've heard so far, and I think we're all here in the spirit that needs to continue. So what students and educators can do is basically to hold events like this, and to, from there, talk about what kind of boycotting, what kind of sanctions, what kind of divestment can we do? What kind of presentation to the media can we do? What can we do in our everyday lives, in our individual communities, that will then impact, as we have the international scale, on the international level?
Thank you. Perfect time.
You were talking about being students and that you're in the media, and it reminded me of a Gore Vidal quote. He said, journalism is printing what someone else does not want printed. Everything else is public relations. So I would argue journalists have to be critical, not neutral. I think US media, I work with media daily, but I think US journalists have this idea that neutrality or objectivity is saying a quote from someone and a quote someone else, and it's not finding the truth. So on an individual level, moving that from media and journalism and the responsibility of journalists to print what someone does not want printed, it is for you to know what people do not want you to know. That's where it starts. Educating yourselves, and watching the documentaries and reading the literature and understanding the facts, understanding the reality on the ground. And after you know, you have to speak truth to power. That is what is missing from the conversation right now. Where is your member of Congress on this? Have you ever, you can't complain about someone in life not doing something the way you wanted them to do it if you never ever asked them, if you never tried to engage in a conversation with them. So after learning and after understanding the conflict and after becoming a conscious consumer, are you buying products that are made in illegal settlements? Where are your tax dollars going directly as taxpayers? Why is public school institutions in the United States getting defunded and foreign military aid to Israel is currently increasing? After you become comfortable enough with that, I urge you to meet with your member of Congress and to speak truth to power and to organize truth to power. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can do that at the consumer level.
Thank you. Dr. Mara?
Yeah, I mean, if I wanted to have the greatest impact here, I would think about, I tend to think in political terms about strategic leverage points. And I would say that in terms of the greatest, what I think the most effective leverage point would be here is to focus on the settler movement, which I think is the most damaging kind of out of control element in this whole picture. Particularly because it's believes it's divinely right to be there, and that the people involved in it are inherently superior. I mean, they're God's chosen people, right? So I'm not saying pick on eliminate them, but what I am saying is that idea that anyone is divinely entitled to lord over other people, that idea needs to be completely delegitimized in Israel and everywhere. And so we can work on a kind of political and ideological movement to delegitimize the settler ideology, wherever it is. And it's very strong in the United States because we still live under the vestiges of the Puritans who settled here. And their manifest destiny is an extension of that, right? So again, we need to look in the mirror and maybe purify ourselves of Puritanism. I don't know.